Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the notions that Kant makes constant reference to in the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, in addition to that of the goodwill and complex things that are a little bit harder to wrap our heads around, like autonomy, heteronomy, a priori, things like that, is this word duty. And it comes up over and over and over again. And I've seen students get mixed up about this quite often. Kant has a very important, precise understanding of what it is for an action to actually, or a volition, a willing, to be not only in accordance with duty, but done from duty. That's what gives an action or a volition its moral worth in Kant's view. That's what makes a will a good will. So when we're trying to understand the nature of the good will, the one good thing that's good without qualification according to Kant, we're looking at this conception of duty. We want to make sense out of the concept of a will, as he says, estimable in itself, good apart from any further end. Now, that's going to involve duty, but simply doing what we normally conceive of as our duties, the things that we ought to do, that doesn't get us to where we need to be. That doesn't actually address this in the way that Kant wants to lead us. So let's actually look at this, what he calls the concept of duty itself. Not just the experience of having duties, like say being assigned chores, or having made a promise to a friend and feeling yourself under an obligation to fulfill that obligation that you've undertaken, that promise that you've made. Not just legal duties, not just duties that are connected with rights that we have as things that we know in our society. So for instance, if you have a right to free speech that's granted to you by the state, I'm supposed to not interfere with your free speech, right? There's a lot of different ways that could happen, though, and that's why it's so important for Kant to get away from these experiential, what he calls empirical, ways of wrapping our head around. We want to think about the mere concept, the pure concept of duty. And he says that this includes the concept of a good will. So within the conception of actually doing duty or following duty or fulfilling duty is a certain way of orienting ourselves towards it, a certain way of making ourselves do it. So it's not just a sort of external getting ourselves in line with what it is that we are told we ought to do but don't really feel like doing that constitutes duty. If we think about the concept itself, there's something a bit deeper, something a bit more rich, something a bit more, not necessarily, yeah, I guess you could say pure involved. And when he talks about the idea of a goodwill, he also says that the goodwill, if we're understanding in terms of duty, has what he calls subjective limitations and obstacles. And because he doesn't tell you what those are, you might just pass over that part of the text and say, yeah, that's all sorts of philosopher stuff. But there really is something important that he's getting at there. So let's go through this bit by bit, this section, and see what we can dig at. So he says, we're trying to elucidate the concept of a will, good apart from any further end. This concept, which is already present in a sound natural understanding and requires not so much to be taught as to be clarified. How do we clarify it? by thinking it through, by stripping away some of the preconceptions that we have about it and really figuring out what lies at the root of this. So he says, we're going to take up the concept of duty, and these subjective limitations and obstacles don't actually hide a goodwill or disguise it. They bring out by contrast and make it shine more brightly. And he says, and here he's going to divide actions up into a couple different types. So if we have actions or volitions, things that we do, things that we will, but maybe don't actually bring about, they can be against duty, or they can be in agreement with duty, right? Some actions right from the start are going to be clearly immoral. Poisoning a person, it doesn't really matter for Kant what sort of reason you did it for. It goes contrary to your duty. Deliberately telling a person something that is untrue, which will get them terribly maimed or injured. There's no way from a Kantian perspective that you're going to make that part of your duty. That's going to be in accordance with duty. That's always going to be a bad action. There's certain things. That's one of the nice things about Kantian moral theory, whether you agree with it or disagree with it. It is very clear on certain things. Certain things are clearly against duty, so we're not going to worry about that so much. We're interested now in actions that are actually in agreement with duty. So where you're doing the thing that you ought to do. You're engaging in the action that you ought to be doing. You're actually choosing that action. That's what it means to have a free will. You're choosing to do that thing, that action. You're choosing that policy, that course towards the world, towards other people, towards yourself, towards the things that you have control over. The question is, why are you doing it? What is what Kant calls your motive? What is your purpose behind that action or that volition? So, here's where there's a fundamental dividing line. It's possible to do the right thing, but to do it for what Kant considers to be not necessarily the wrong reasons, but not the right reasons. The only right reason is ultimately because it's the right thing to do, because it is your duty, because you choose to will in accordance with and from duty. You make that your sole motive. Anything else, what he calls some other motive or principle, is going to make the action not necessarily immoral, something against duty, but it's going to deprive it of its moral worth. So you could say that it becomes amoral or non-moral. The only thing that's truly moral, that has moral worth, are actions that are in agreement with duty and that are done from the motive of duty. And so he gives you some examples. These are ones that he considers later on. A grocer or any merchant who is giving a fair price to customers, right? Now, if he gives an unfair price to customers, he screws some people over, he's doing something that goes against duty. He should give a fair price, right? The question is, why is he doing it? Why is he giving a fair price? Is he doing that because he recognizes that that's the right thing to do, and he actually does that in every circumstance, even when it doesn't necessarily pay off for him, or translate into some benefit, or fulfill some other thing that he wants to achieve? Or is he doing the good action, the right thing, because he's motivated by something else? In that case, it's not really the good action that he is choosing for himself. He's choosing that as a means to a certain end. And the end could be any of these sort of things. And these overlap quite a bit. He gives some examples with the grocer, right? Maybe the grocer is acting out of self-interest. Maybe he thinks, hey, I better not overcharge people, because if I do, then the cops are going to come in and they're going to bust me, or people are going to get wise to this and say, hey, don't go to him, he screws you over, it's kind of random. There could be all sorts of things where somebody, reasons this out and says, I shouldn't do the wrong thing. I should do the right thing, but I should do it because it's good business. You know, you often hear this in business ethics. People say, why should businesses be ethical? Well, because it improves the bottom line. Well, that would be, you know, a perfect example of what Kant is talking about here. That's not, you know, that's very far from doing the right thing or being ethical because it's important to be ethical. If you're doing it just because it improves the bottom line or keeps your public image alive or keeps you out of trouble, then you're doing it for some other reason than because it's the right thing, Kant would say. That's not a, you know, fully in line with duty then. What else? Immediate inclination. Maybe he loves everybody. Maybe he's the kind of person who's just personable and enjoys dealing with people and customers, and so he wants to give them a fair price because he feels good towards them, right? You could say the same thing about teachers, maybe. You know, do I have a duty to teach my students and to make sure that all of them actually learn? Yes. Now, why? Well, because I'm getting paid, because if I don't do that, I'll get in trouble, because I just happen to like these people and I enjoy the act of teaching. Kant would say any of those sort of things are getting away from doing duty for its own sake. Other inclinations, you know, there's another number of different possible inclinations that we have that could lead to this. Maybe somebody says, I'm going to do the right thing because I want to carry out an experiment with my life. I want to see what doing the right thing will bring about for me. And I'm not necessarily trying to attain some sort of beneficial good or you know, enjoyable good for myself. I'm just curious. Well, that wouldn't be acting out of duty either. That would be acting in accordance with duty, but not from duty. Our feelings. You know, we tend to look at it as a good thing if we have good feelings towards other people. Kant says, well, they're not bad. You know, it's good to have good feelings towards other people, but it's not morally good. It's not something that makes an action or a willing, a choice on your part, something that's morally good. So, you know, he gives some other examples here, which I'm going to skip over. We want to get to a little bit further on. He talks about, he makes a distinction here. He says, it's doubtless in this sense we should understand the passages from Scripture in which we're commanded to love our neighbor and even our enemy. Love out of inclination cannot be commanded. You can have it, right? You can be inclined to love other people, even to love enemies. But you can't command that. But kindness done from duty, although no inclination impels us, and even though natural and unconquerable disinclination stands in our way, is practical and not pathological love, residing in the will and not in the propensions of feeling. You know, the idea that he's getting at here is that when we're acting from duty, for the sake of duty, not out of consideration of what we're going to get out of it for some inclination, because we're already sort of headed in that direction, but we make ourselves do that. In a certain way, there's a purity of will present that's not present in these cases. There's much more that could be said about that, but I'm not going to try to unpack that here. Then he gives us a few propositions. And these are important when it comes to duty as well. So I'm actually going to erase some of this stuff over here so we can sort of unpack these. The first one is basically along the lines of what I was just erasing, telling us that we should act out of duty. We should act out of duty, not just in accordance with duty. So, and you can understand out of as motivated by Okay, so that's the first thing that we can say about duty. Another thing that he says is, an action done from duty has its moral worth not in the purpose to be attained by it, but in the maxim in accordance with which it is decided upon. It depends, therefore, not on the realization of the object of the action, but solely on the principle of volition, in accordance with which the action has been performed. So there's a lot of jargon here. Let's put down some of this so we can make some sense out of this. There's a term that he's using here that we want to focus on. An action done from duty has its moral worth, so it is good, morally good, not from its purpose, not from the effects that you're trying to achieve by it, but by its maxim, in accordance with which it is decided upon. So, another way of putting this, if we wanted to use some concrete examples, would be to say that when we're acting and we're doing the right thing, we're choosing the right thing, what makes it good is not the purpose of the action, what it is that the action is supposed to bring about, but the form or the kind of thing that we're willing, the description that we could give to it. So, think for example about giving water to a thirsty person out in the desert, right? One of these sort of classical movie motifs. Some guy is crawling around saying, water, water, you've got a canteen of water, you give it to him. He drinks the water. You've done a good thing. What made it good? Now, in a certain sense, it's good because his body stays alive and all that. And Kant says, yeah, that's fine. We're interested in the moral goodness of the action now. So when you actually gave him the canteen, when you chose to do that, instead of saying, well, screw you, I'm going to go over here, or I need to keep my water for myself, or, everyone's got their own water, you've obviously used up yours. When you've decided to give him your water, it wasn't that you had this purpose of, say, feeling good, or keeping God happy with you, or keeping this guy alive, or any of the actual empirical effects of it. It was you deciding on a certain maxim, a certain rule that describes the kind of action, the kind of willing that you're engaged in. So the maxim in that sort of case would be something along the lines of, whenever I see a person in need of resources which I have at my disposal and can grant to that person, I will in fact grant those resources to that person. There's other ways we could describe that maxim. It's that maxim that makes the action done from duty good. So even if it backfired, or even if I had other inclinations, I was like, showing off for somebody, let's say I was kind of, mixed mind about this. If I was actually forcing myself to do it, nevertheless, because I recognize that that's the sort of action that a person ought to do, because it's that kind of action that meets that sort of maxim, then my action would have moral worth. My choice would have moral value. The other thing that he says that's particularly important, he talks about a third proposition that's an inference from these others, and he says, duty is the necessity to act out of reverence for the law. So duty is the necessity to act out of reverence for the law, and what law does he actually mean? The moral law. Not just any old law, but the moral law. Kant thinks that, although we don't follow it all the time and we don't recognize it much of the time, within the human being, because the human being is rational, there is a moral law which we can come to recognize. And the moral law includes these things that we call maxims, the certain kinds of maxims. Tells us that we ought to do this, we ought not to do this, tells us what sort of dispositions to a certain degree we ought to have, what kind of beings we ought to make of ourselves. So duty is going to be involving, on the person's part, the person who's actually acting out of duty, has a kind of reverence for the moral law. They recognize it as being something valuable for its own sake, not because it's good business, or because it makes them happy, or because God likes it, or because mom and dad told you you need to do it, or any of those sorts of reasons. It's good because it is good, because it is the moral law. And for Kant, you reach a certain bedrock point where, he can keep on giving you all sorts of other deductions and reasonings, but you reach a certain bedrock point where if somebody says, well, yeah, but why should I have reverence for the moral law? Kant would actually have to look at him and say, because you ought to. That's what it means for it to be the moral law. It's the kind of thing that you ought to have reverence for. And now that's not a word that we use an awful lot these days. What does reverence mean? Practically speaking, reverence is not so much about feeling a certain way as about choosing and behaving a certain way. You tell what a person has reverence for by the structure of their actions, the patterns of their reactions, the fabric of the life that they form, the character that they display. So somebody who has reverence, for example, for the flag would be willing to actually charge up a hill to fight other people to keep the flag from dipping. It's kind of in some ways a trivial thing, but when somebody has reverence for the flag, hopefully it's not just that piece of fabric up there, it's because they have reverence for what it represents. When somebody has reverence for the moral law, that means that they, when push comes to shove, when inclination sets up obstacles and says, hey, let's cut a corner here. You don't have to be so rigorous. The person says, no, this is actually precisely the sort of case where I need to be rigorous, because that's what it means to actually recognize duty. Not just as something that's imposed on somebody from without, as a chore, as a regulation, as an imposition, but as something that you say, yeah, as a reasonable person, I see this is what I ought to do. This is the right thing, and even though I don't really feel like doing it, I gotta make myself somehow do this right thing. That's what it would be to act from duty. And you notice all three of these imply each other, they connect with each other, they reinforce each other. So this is what Kant means by duty as being the motive of the good will. It's not something that you can reduce just to a bunch of examples. This is something that he thinks you have to think out as a concept. I think it is helpful to use examples to make sense of this, and we did a few in this. Kant himself uses a few examples. But ultimately it comes down to these sorts of rules. So that's the conception of duty.